Hey, it's Grace here at the WRAL Daily Download. This week we're revisiting some of your favorite episodes from 2024. Today we're listening back to a personal favorite of mine. This is the story of Shiloh, a historic black community in the North Carolina mountains. You know that landscape as being home to the Biltmore. Here's the story and the special connection that our Gerald Owens has to it. Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Grace Holland. When you think of North Carolina's iconic buildings, you likely think of the Biltmore House. It's a symbol of Gilded Age excess and luxury, and you may be surprised to learn it owes its location, construction, and years of its operation to black men and women who lived in that area. WRAL News anchor Gerald Owens has a special connection to this story. Gerald, thanks for joining me today. I've been looking forward to talking to you about this since you told me about it last month.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yeah, we have a connection. I'd always known that my family owned part of the land upon which Biltmore sits, but it was one of those things that we talked about years ago and just never came back up. I was touring the mansion over the holidays with my brother and his wife, and there's a placard in the basement of a man named William Logan, who was the foreman on the construction of the Biltmore House. And it also mentioned, and I saw where the photo came from, was a woman named Viola Owens Turner. Mm-hmm. And it clicked. I said, I've got to find out what the connection is. I never did any research on it. I just took it for granted, and that was it. But that's how I got it in my head that I wanted to find out more about this, and that's why we did the story.
Gotcha. And so in the story, you spend a lot of time talking about the Shiloh community. So how did that journey get you to Shiloh, and where is Shiloh?
Yeah, Shiloh is in Asheville. It's in fact, to understand this, you got to go back to Old Shiloh. Right now, what exists is called New Shiloh. Mm-hmm. Old Shiloh was a community of a couple dozen black families on the top of the mountain in Asheville. And the word is that George Vanderbilt and his mother were visiting North Carolina. He was on horseback riding through the countryside, and happened upon this vista, and it blew him away. And so he said, "I've got to have that land." Mm. And the hard part about this whole thing is, how are you going to convince people who were just enslaved, many of them 20 years before, to give up the first property they'd ever owned?
Right.
So it was a monumental task that he had ahead of him.
Yeah. And so who did you talk to for this story before we kind of get into how he did all of that?
We spoke to the curator over at Biltmore,
okay,
a woman named Anita White, who is a resident of New Shiloh and a distant relative of mine, her brother, Spencer, and also some researchers over at UNC Asheville. I also found out quickly in the early stages of this, while planning this story, UNC Asheville is doing a project on, basically what they're doing is they're mapping family histories using gravestones and black family histories in western North Carolina. And they were working on this community and my family in particular. They had 4 families there. They had students. You're assigned to this family, you're assigned to that family. Well, there's a group of students assigned to the Owens family. And I thought that was so neat. I couldn't wait to talk to them. So I talked to one of those students, and I talked to the woman who's the head of that project, Dr. Ellen Pearson.
Wow, a lot of people with a lot of different kinds of expertise, it sounds like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So how did George Vanderbilt get the people in Shiloh to sell that land to him?
One of his representatives hired William Logan, I talked about. Mm-hmm. And William Logan, he was trusted in the community. He was a preacher. He convinced them to sell. And not only, Vanderbilt offered them quite a bit of money, several times what they'd paid for it. So it was almost too good to pass up, except for one person.
There's always one, right?
Yes. One guy held out for about 10 years and finally sold, and it became quite, not scandalous, but it became a big story in the Asheville area.
Oh, really?
And the rumor was that he was offered anywhere from $9,000 to $65,000 back in the late 1900s, which would be a king's ransom today, and he wouldn't sell.
Yeah.
And finally sold it for $2,000.
Yeah. Wow. Let's take a quick break right there, and we'll be right back. Okay, so Gerald, you talked about how George Vanderbilt got these families to sell the land, and there was a holdout, and it took a lot of time. What happened to those Shiloh families after the Vanderbilts got that land?
Well, the Shiloh community had about 325 acres. George Vanderbilt bought 125,000.
Wow.
So it was a small part of it, but it was the main part of it because that's where the mansion is right where that Shiloh community was. And if you've been to Biltmore, you know there's the mansion and the winery and the horse, the stables and that kind of thing. That's Shiloh land, or it was. He moved the family, moved them all, about a mile away because many of them were going to work on the construction. So it was about a mile away as the crow flies so they can still get back and forth to and from work easily. So he moved them, he moved their homes, their church, the graves, and he uprooted all the people there and moved them over to New Shiloh, which exists today.
And what can you tell me about your family members' connection? I know in your story you talk a bit about Sylvester Owens and his role.
Right. Yeah, Sylvester was born in New Shiloh right after the move. But his parents and grandparents and cousins and Anita's, Logan, William Logan is related to me. He married a woman who is my direct ancestor. So that's kind of and my great-great-grandfather, Butler Owens, lived in that community. And ironic about him, he actually served for the Confederate Army in the Civil War.
Wow.
As a cook. He was considered a free man of color. He was half Indian, half white. That was his makeup. So he was in the Civil War, and Butler's ancestors were all there in Shiloh, many of them. So that's the connection there, the familial connection.
Gotcha. And then what did his role at Biltmore become?
Now specifically, many of them worked there. Many of the Owens family and the White family and they worked at Biltmore in some fashion. My uncle Sylvester, who's my grandfather's first cousin, was the groundskeeper there for 44 years. He became the head groundskeeper. But prior to him becoming the head groundskeeper, he worked with a man named Chauncey Beadle, who was the head groundskeeper. He died. That's when Sylvester took over. But Chauncey and Sylvester would travel the country looking for different species of azaleas and bring them back to Biltmore. If you've ever seen the azalea gardens at Biltmore, they're wonderful, one of the best in the country, if not the world. And that was always Sylvester's dream and Chauncey's dream. So when Chauncey died, the owner, or the person who ran Biltmore at that time, said, we want to keep him on, make him head gardener. He knows more about it than anybody else. So he basically oversaw most of the plantings at Biltmore, not just the azaleas, but that was his passion.
Wow. And I bet that's a lot of plants and flowers to have to take care of if it's not even just the azaleas. That's really impressive.
Right. It really was.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about UNC Asheville's project that they're working on and how they're kind of, each student is kind of picking a family and working. So what is sort of the ultimate goal of that project? What is the push to keep these people remembered like?
They're going to create a database where anyone can go and get information about these families which have been largely forgotten. And that's the goal, to make sure that these communities aren't forgotten, that their importance is remembered, and people can find it. One of the things in this cemetery, the New Shiloh Cemetery, a lot of the bodies that were moved weren't marked. So they're basically just a piece of stone in the ground. Yeah. And there are a couple of dozen of those. So, you go walk by it and you maybe look inside. There's some of the big headstones with all the word names and dates and all that kind of thing. But there are a lot of people there, they don't even know who they are. And also, I learned that there could still be some bodies over at Biltmore. They didn't get them all.
Oh, man.
Because if you look in certain parts of it, you'll see the indentations, which would denote, a partial graveyard. So the story is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like it's just going to keep going and going.
Yeah.
What was it like for you with your family connections to go there? And I'm sure you're kind of now seeing Biltmore through a new light, now knowing that that's Old Shiloh. But even visiting New Shiloh, going through that cemetery, what was that like for you?
It was peaceful, and just because I'd met Sylvester before as a kid, it was just like my grandfather, and a spitting image of my dad. But I'd met him a long, long time ago, and there were some other people whose names on those gravestones I'd met. I had cousin Tempe. She was probably 80 years old when I saw her as a kid, but she was cousins with my grandfather, and she had a candy store down the street. It was actually, she sold candy out of her house, but as a kid, you think, let's go down to Tempe's and get some candy from the store.
Right.
I saw her grave there, and I saw a lot of familiar names. And it's kind of interesting because until now, we had, and I think a lot of people are like this, you keep in touch with your family and maybe the next level, i.e. cousins, first cousins, but most people don't go far beyond that.
Yes.
They just kind of stay right there with what they know, and if they learn more information later, that's great. Mm-hmm. But that was my experience. I just felt like I was where I needed to be at home, and the Biltmore connection, I had always felt a little connection to Biltmore based on what I knew.
Yeah.
Well, even though I didn't know much of it at all until now.
Yeah, so I'm sure that just made it even stronger then.
Yeah.
What's the big takeaway that you want people to hear in this story and sort of the changes that the Shiloh community went through?
Put yourselves in their position. Someone approaches you, a white man who you've never met, wants to buy you out of your land that you just acquired a short time ago and uproot your whole family. Dig up the graves and move the people, your loved ones that you buried there. I can't personally fathom how they were able to do that, regardless of the money. But, I don't know if maybe they felt compelled, maybe they didn't think that they had a choice, but I know they were treated well, and I know that they were paid well. But I want people to remember that there is a group of people that made a sacrifice so we can all enjoy Biltmore House. That's not why Biltmore built the mansion, but that's what it's become. Right.
Well, and some of that land, didn't it also become Smoky Mountains Park, I think?
Yes. Out of that 125,000 acres, he sold all but 8,000. That's what the land, the estate has now. So he sold well over 100,000 acres back to the state and the federal government.
Yeah, so in a roundabout way, here we are all enjoying Shiloh.
Yep.
Because of what they did, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Gerald. I really appreciate you sharing this story with us. Since that story aired, Hurricane Helene devastated much of western North Carolina and killed more than 100 people at last count. We know that much of the area around Biltmore was flooded, but the mansion itself was not damaged, and it reopened for the holidays last month. We were curious about how Shiloh fared during the storm. I reached out to the Shiloh Community Association, and they tell me that luckily they were spared from the floodwaters. Some of the homes were damaged by falling trees and wind, and the Community Association is still helping homeowners with those repairs, along with the Asheville Habitat for Humanity. Thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. You can sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.